Okay, today's position is by a famous world champion called Alexander Alekhine, or Alekhine. There's various ways to pronounce the name. Alekhine was a Russian grandmaster and world champion of chess. And being a Russian name, there's various ways to pronounce it. I recently ran into a fellow whose grandfather was a grandmaster of chess called Buk, and he played Alekhine and tells me that that's how it's pronounced. So I'm not going to second guess him. So this position here was played in Paris in France in a simultaneous exhibition in 1913, and Alekhine was playing 100 people at a time. He came to be playing a simultaneous exhibition in France because he lived there by that stage. He originally grew up in Russia, but the politics of Russia at that time meant that he had to leave the country. He was a very rich man in Russia, and the Russian Revolution was about to happen, and so he got out of the country and ended up living in France. The reason it's an interesting position is that it's not very often that somebody can declare checkmate in 10 in a chess position. Normally in a chess position you've got several realistic choices of move. Obviously there's some bad moves and there's some good moves. What the human mind tends to do is get rid of most of the bad moves and just ignore them. And so we come up with 4 or 5 choices for each position. And to look a long way ahead is difficult, because if you've got to look at 5 different possible moves each time, then that has a multiplying effect. So if you want to look 1 move ahead, you've got to look 5 times 5. You've got to look at 25 positions. And then if you want to look 2 moves ahead, you've got to look at 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 positions, or 25 times 5, which is 125 of course, and then times 5 again. So already, just to look 2 moves ahead, you're sort of up around the 600 position mark. And when you get to 10 moves ahead, well, if there was 5 choices each time, you'd be in the millions. You'd have to look at 1 million positions. So it's very rare for somebody to be able to look 10 moves ahead. The reason you can look 10 moves ahead in certain positions is that there are what are called forced moves, or forced variations. When your opponent doesn't have any choice or hardly any choice of response, you can look further ahead, because you can decide, well, if he did that move, I'd do this move, or I'd do one of these 2 moves. And so the number of positions you have to look at is drastically reduced, and so it's easier to look ahead. This position here is famous because Alekhine came to the board and declared checkmate in 10. And he could do that because all the variations were, well, most of the variations or most of the moves were forced, and the ones that weren't had hardly any choice, maybe 1 or 2 choices. So let's have a look what happened. Alekhine playing white, giving a simultaneous exhibition. Now, the first move, he moves his queen to h5 check. Now, there's 2 choices here. You can block with the pawn, and if you do that, well, the next move is checkmate. Can you see the checkmate move? Yeah, queen takes g6 checkmate. So that's not a very good choice. That's mate in 2. So that's an easy variation to see. A much better choice, going back to the original choice with the knight, is to take the queen, of course. One of the 3 ways out of check is to capture. And so there was only 2 choices. It was pretty easy to work out what to do. And Alekhine saw next a double check. You'll see that there's a double check here. After the pawn takes, f takes e6, double check. All right, you've got the rook that's here is in line with the king, and the pawn is also checking the king, so it's a double check. When you're in double check, the only way out is to move the king. The other 2 choices are gone, because you can't capture the checking piece because there's 2 of them, and you can't block checks from 2 pieces at once either. Okay, so a double check was played, and this green highlighted square is the only place that the king can go to. So the reason I've highlighted the square is that it's a forced move. So this idea of not having many choices to choose from and being able to look further ahead as a result, this is one of the situations where it's easy to look further ahead, because you know exactly where the king's going. He has to go to that square. He's got no other choice. So the king goes there, and now Alekhine gives his check with the bishop. So the bishop moves across. It was guarding this pawn here. Now it doesn't have to do that task anymore. And it plays a check here. And you'll see this red highlighted square. Again, a forced move. That's the only place the king can go. That's the only response allowed for that check. So because it's a forced move again, there's not too many, it's not too hard to look further ahead. The king goes down to g5. Now Alekhine plays his rook up to f5, check. And in this particular position, you've got two choices for the king. He can go to g6, or he can go down to h4. Now if he goes down to h4, then the rook plays to h4, or e4 rather, check. And there's only one move again, a forced move. There's no squares the king can go to. Each square that he could go to is protected or guarded. And so the only possible choice is the knight blocking. And then of course the next move is checkmate. Can you see the checkmate move? How would you checkmate there? That's right, you'd play rook takes, and that would be a checkmate. So going back to the position where the rook was checking the king, if he goes down to h4, he's going to end up in checkmate very quickly. So the better choice was king g6, and Pratt, the player who was playing black in this position in the simultaneous exhibition, found that best move and played back to g6. And Alekhine follows up with rook f6 check. So again, it's a double check. The bishop here checks the king along the line, and also the rook checks. So it's a double check. So when the rook moves, it discovers a check by the bishop along this line here, and it's also checking across. So another double check. So once again, the king has to move to get out of the check, and once again, there's only one choice. So I've highlighted the square again where he can move to, which is g5. So Alekhine's able to look a long way ahead, because to get this far, he hasn't actually had to look at that many positions. Normally, to be looking 5 moves ahead, he'd be looking at literally thousands of positions. But in this particular position, he's only had to look at maybe 20 to 30 positions to get to this result. Okay, so king comes down to g5, and Alekhine played his rook to g6 check. And there's a couple of choices in this position. You could go to h4, and you could also go to f4. Now, the best choice is h4, and we'll have a look at that in detail later. But if you went to f4, the rook comes up to e4, and gives check. Which again, the king has to go to f5 now. There's no choice. And who can see the checkmate move here? You play your rook across, and you discover and give checkmate. The bishop gives the checkmate, the rook guards the other rook, and covers f4, and it's mate. So the rook came to g6. If you go to f4, you get mated in a couple of moves, and so the best choice is to go to h4. Alekhine follows up with his rook up to e4, giving check, and now we're in another situation where there's no choices. There's just the one forced move. The rook has to, the knight has to block at f4. So knight blocks at f4. Rook takes, check. Another situation with a forced move, king up to h5. And now, when Alekhine announced checkmate in 10, this was probably the hardest part of the analysis that he had to do. He would have been able to get this far in his mind fairly easily, and then he has to find a way to finish off here. And what he does in this position is something called a quiet move. All of the moves that you've seen have been checks, basically, just attacking, very attacking moves, with forced replies. The reply by black has been obvious. In this position here, the king's helpless. If you can check him, you win. But finding a check's the hard part. And so what Alekhine comes up with here is something called a quiet move. Basically, he needs to be able to give a check, and he's going to play a quiet move to do it. Do you think you can see what move he would play here so that he can checkmate in the following move? So in other words, this is if you like, a puzzle within a puzzle. This is a checkmate in 2 position. See if you can solve the checkmate. What move would you play to give checkmate in 2 moves? Yeah, Alekhine came up with the quiet move g3. He only needs to be able to control this square here. If he can control h4, then he can use his rook to give the checkmate. And now in this position, it doesn't matter what move black plays. White's next move will be a checkmate. And so black chose knight f6. Pratt decided to continue with the position just because it was an amazing thing to have a checkmate in 10 declared, so he played it out rather than resigning or giving up the game. And the rook comes to h4 and it's checkmate. So that was an amazing checkmate by Alexander Alekhine. Here's a picture of him. You can see he's signed the front of it. Gives you a bit of a look at the bloke. And the other thing that I've got for you, this is a picture of Alekhine playing in that simultaneous exhibition. So this gives you a bit of a flavour of the thing. People dressed a bit differently back then. Everybody wore suits with waistcoats. You can see Alekhine's got his waistcoat and his little high collar there, and everybody dressed up very formally. People were much more formal back then. And this idea of declaring checkmate was one of the formal things that happened back then. And you can see that everybody had very stiff backs and carried themselves with a lot of pride, etc. And all these players were good chess players. And they liked to try their skill against Alekhine. Alekhine played lots of similes when he was in France. As I say, when he was in Russia, he was a very rich man. But something called the Russian Revolution came along and basically meant that he had to get out of the place because he was a rich man in Russia and went on to live in France and had to do things like give simultaneous exhibitions to make ends meet. So that was Alekhine. What I reckon we'll do now is, just like Alekhine, we should solve some checkmate puzzles. We're not going to do checkmate in tens. That's a little bit too hard, a bit too ambitious even for me. What we're going to do is do a few checkmate in 2 puzzles. Okay, here's the first position, and it's white to move and checkmate in 2 moves. So take a look at this position and see what you would play. Okay, I'm going to get you to put in your answer now. If you need more time, you should push the pause button to keep pondering the position. Okay, solution in this position is for the rook to come up. It's check on the king. 3 ways out of check: move to a safe square. Well, you can't do that. There's no safe square. Capture the checking piece. You can't do it with the king, but you can do it with the rook. And obviously there's no blocking because it's on giving check on the next square across. Rook takes. And you'll see that the bishop and also the rook control the square here. And so it's very easy to go on with the checkmate. Rook takes rook, checkmate. So checkmate in 2 solved. Okay, here's another one. This pattern here is a very important pattern. As we do checkmate puzzles, one of the very important reasons for doing checkmate puzzles is that you're creating patterns in your mind that you can use when you recognize similar situations in your games. And you're also increasing your ability to analyze, to look around the board and find the best move. And the way you solve checkmate puzzles is you try every possible check and every possible capture in your mind, and you see what it leads to. And the other idea you need to keep in mind is that checkmate is like a net. It's like a net of squares around the king. You have to block off the access to each square for the king. And if you've blocked off access to each square around the king, in other words, by the rules of chess, he's not allowed to go there, and you're also attacking him and he can't get out of the attack, that's checkmate. So that's the sort of 2 things you need to bear in mind, is that you're going to try every possible check and capture, and that checkmate is a net. And as you do puzzles, you'll be able to use these patterns again and again in your games. This particular checkmate pattern I use all the time. It's one of my favorites. I love getting my rooks up on the 7th rank, particularly if I can get them both up there together. They just become incredibly powerful, especially if the king is trapped on the back row like this. So these 2 rooks here are what we call pigs on the 7th rank. They're basically feeding like pigs down there. They can eat up all the pawns, and in this particular case, they're going to eat up the king. Now, can you see the checkmate? It's checkmate in 2. If you need more time, hit the pause button, and let's have your answer now. Okay, the answer or solution is rook takes pawn check. This rook guards the other rook, so the king can't take it. He only has one choice, in other words it's a forced reply. King has to come across here to g8, and the checkmate move is rook over checkmate. So this little rook here is helping to bring about the downfall of the king by blocking his escape over there. So checkmate in 2. Okay, here's another checkmate in 2 puzzle. This one uses a double check. Again, doing checkmate puzzles is fantastic practice because it uses all sorts of techniques that you can then see and use in your games. What you're doing is creating neural pathways, and this is how the brain learns. It sees a pattern and remembers it, and then in a similar situation in your game, you're creating more and more options that you can use. You're basically accumulating weapons that you can use at any time. Okay, so in this position it's checkmate in 2 for white again. White's going to checkmate on his next move, but what's his move here? What would you play? If you need more time, press pause, but I need your solution now. Yeah, okay. We do a double check. Pawn takes pawn, the h-pawn takes, and when it takes, the rook is now checking the king, and the pawn is as well. So there's no way that this pawn can capture this pawn or anything like that. The king must move when it's a double check. He only has one square he can move to, so he moves to that square. He moves to that square. Boom. And in this position, this is a very easy mate in 1. White has control of h7, so he moves his rook up, and it's good night. Checkmate of the king. Once again, you see the black's own pieces contribute to the checkmate by occupying key squares around the king. So checkmate puzzles is definitely something you should work on and use in your chess. There are books, many books full of checkmate puzzles, plenty of puzzles on the internet, very good practice. You should certainly be doing probably 15% of your chess practice should be checkmate puzzles or more. If you only did checkmate puzzles all the time, you'd still be a very strong chess player if that was the only training you ever did, because it's just very good for practicing analysis and seeing patterns and creating patterns in your head. Okay, so that was Alekhine and his famous checkmate in 10. I believe it's the longest, in a middle game position, it's the longest ever declared checkmate in 10. Declaring checkmate is something that's sort of out of fashion now. Certainly when Alekhine played, it was very viewed very favourably if you could announce a checkmate in 7 or something like that. This was seen as something that was very impressive, and it is very impressive, but it basically went out of style because too many grandmasters would announce checkmate in 7 and then end up with egg on their face because it wasn't actually a forced checkmate. So people stopped doing it, and what they tended to do, as is human nature, is put a note that they thought it was checkmate in 7, and then when they were proved correct later on say, yes, I knew it was checkmate in 7 from that point, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to embarrass my opponent. But these days it doesn't happen, but back then, yep, it was the thing to do, and who knows, maybe in your games at some stage you'll get a chance to declare checkmate in 10 or something like that. And if you ever do, please let me know. I'll be impressed. Okay, so that was Alekhine and his famous checkmate in 10.